Hello, everyone. This is the Jeannette Rankin Peace Center with Russ Faure-Brac, former defense engineer and author of Transition to Peace, a defense engineer's search for an alternative to war. So, Russ, why are you here in Missoula?
I am on a cross-country motorcycle trip. Uh, this is a card that shows where I'm going. I started in San Francisco, took a southern route to Washington, D.C., and then up into Canada through the Great Lakes to Minneapolis. And now I'm following the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance route uh, across northern states to California back home.
Oh,
Now, why am I doing that?
sure.
Originally, my idea was to do an adventure trip. Then last year I wrote this book called Transition to Peace, and I decided to give presentations on my book along the way. And then about halfway through the trip, it more or less turned into a vision quest, where I started having insights about myself and where I was going from here. And anyway, that trip has led me here to Missoula. I'm a few days away from completing the trip.
Okay. What is your book about?
The book is about basically a new national security policy. In When I was in graduate school, I worked part-time for Stanford Research Institute, a defense company, and I was doing weapons systems analysis. And one day I was working with a top secret map of North Vietnam with all their radar and missile locations. And as I stared at that map, I just thought, war is crazy. There's got to be an alternative. So I spent about a year studying nonviolence at the Joan Baez the Institute of Nonviolence. And after that year, I concluded that there was, in fact, an alternative to war, even though I had a very fuzzy idea of what that meant. And I felt I couldn't continue my work, and I resigned my position. I then went into a career of environmental planning. I retired in 1995. And then when the events of 9/11 occurred in 2001, it reawakened all those old interests that I had in issues of war and peace. So I began about 10 years of research digging into that question of what is an alternative to war? Is it possible to have one? If so, what would it look like? And most importantly, how can we go from getting where we are today as the world's sole military superpower to a much more nonviolent form of national defense in the future? So that's basically what the book is about. After all those years of research and digging into lots of details on this question, I came up with the bottom line message that I want to get across to people, which is that peace is possible. And the reason I want to get that point across is because if you don't believe that it is, then you can't really do very much to help bring it about. So that's my bottom line message, and I can go into details about it from there.
Okay, so you're writing the book. It's kind of like you said, a vision quest. Could you explain more, like why you were called to kind of do that?
Well, the vision quest I was referring to was some personal experiences I had on the trip. But in a larger sense, the vision quest that I'm on with working on the question of what is an alternative to war has to do with unfinished business for myself from when I did work in the defense industry. I left believing there was an alternative to war, but I didn't have a real good feeling of what that meant. And now that I've completed all this work, I've come to a set of points that I believe show in greater detail why an alternative to war is possible and what that could look like.
So, what are those main points?
Okay, the first point is that as I looked at this, I discovered just how expensive war is. We have a base defense budget of about $600 billion a year, but when you add in the cost of Homeland Security, the Veterans Administration, nuclear weapons research being done in the Department of Energy, You add all that up, and it comes to about $1.3 trillion that we're spending every year on national security. That's a whole lot of money. It's about 62% of our total federal discretionary budget, which doesn't leave a whole lot for all the other programs of health and transportation and education that we want to
Right.
have.
Right.
I also took a look at how much we're spending compared to other countries in the world. If we're spending 1.3 trillion, the next highest expenditure is by China at about 150 billion, much less. And then there's France and Great Britain and Russia and so on down the line. And if you take all the money that all the other countries are spending on defense, it's less than the total amount that the United States is spending. So that's more or less a definition of what it means to be a military economy. So that's the first point. War is very expensive. The second point has to do with how can we break through the tremendous strength of the current political system that perpetuates war. Congress keeps appropriating money for the military. They do that because of political contributions that come to them from large corporations, defense contractors. And I don't believe the change is really going to happen from the top down. However, that's the bad news. However, the good news is that, in a sense it's good news, is that there are a large number of forces at work today that are going to make the existing system very unsustainable. If you think about the exponential growth that we're having in world population, tie that into the amount of carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere causing climate change, the huge instability of the global economic system. An indicator of that is the national debt, our national debt that right now is shooting up exponentially. And then bring in the issue of peak oil, meaning that when oil was first discovered in the late 1800s, we began producing more and more of it every year, and that has been fueling our economy. However, we've now reached the point where at the peak of the amount of oil we're going to be able to produce every year, and in the future, the amount of oil production is going to be dropping. And it's going to drop down to the level where, while there's still oil in the ground, it's going to be too expensive and environmentally damaging to get at it. And we're not going to be able to continue to operate with oil driving our economy. We're going to be entering into some kind of a post-carbon phase. So you take those four factors together, and the whole thing is very unsustainable. I don't know what's going to trigger some kind of collapse, but I think at some point everything's going to start unraveling, which means that we don't have to tear the system down. It's going to probably collapse under its own weight. So that's how we get past the stranglehold that the system has on us right now. We don't have to get out in the streets and protest and demand that it change, although we should. It's not going to be, that alone wouldn't bring about the change that we want, and it's not necessary because I think things are just going to start coming apart on their own. So what I then did is to envision well out into the future what might a more peaceful form of national security look like. And I came up with three basic, what I call peace principles. The first is that we commit to the well-being of the entire world, not just ourselves. The second is that we defend everyone, even our adversaries. And the third is that we use moral force rather than physical force. Now those are very simple principles, but they go to the foundation of how we operate as a society and how we defend ourselves. So from those three principles, I developed 9 programs to implement them, and there are a couple that I want to highlight in this interview.
Okay.
The first is the idea of a global Marshall Plan. It would be based on the Marshall Plan after World War II that rebuilt the economies of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that we declare global poverty as our next enemy and engage in eradicating global poverty under the theory that if other countries are better off, they're going to be much less interested in attacking us. We would be putting a lot of money into that program. We would be asking other countries, what do you need, instead of going in and telling them what we think they need. And it would have to be designed in a way to avoid the kind of corruption that typically happens with foreign aid.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a thumbnail sketch of the Global Marshall Plan. Another key point is that a lot of people argue that we can't demilitarize and have peace because it would throw millions of people out of work. Well, since the end of World War II, the idea of converting the defense industry into domestic production has been studied. And it's a fairly simple thing to do, where the government begins reducing the defense budget and then uses some of that money to send other kinds of contracts to defense contractors so that we can use the engineering and scientific talent in those companies, but doing things other than building weapons. Instead, working on developing alternative energy sources, putting in transportation systems, rebuilding our infrastructure, and that kind of thing. So the idea is that we don't have to throw millions of people out of work if our government will reduce the defense budget enough so that we can start converting how the defense industry operates. Now, that is going to take some real doing. Is Congress going to do that on their own? Is there going to be a President Gandhi who declares that this is how things will be? Highly unlikely. I think that the initiative for this kind of change is much more likely to come from the bottom up, as individuals and organizations demand change, demand that we stop engaging in the wars that we're engaging in, and begin demilitarizing our country. So that's why one of the reasons I'm here at the Rankin Peace Center is because this organization is very impressive. I'm really impressed with what I've seen about how it operates, the number of events that they put on every year. These are the kinds of organizations that when they start coming together, forming a network, reaching a critical mass, I think that's the point where the American public will have the strength to tell government, we want it to change. And the strength of that message will be enough to overcome all of the powers that be that are resisting that change. So
Wow.
that's my statement of what I think the problem is. Wars and militarization is just too expensive, and I think peace is a pocketbook issue. I think the American public is going to begin feeling that war is too expensive, it drives taxes too high, it robs money from social programs. If we reduce the defense budget, we can do more than just shift the money into domestic programs. We can also use it to reduce the national debt. We can use it to lower taxes, which conservatives and liberals both want to have happen. We can make government much more efficient and effective. So anyway, this is my vision of what the future can be, why I think we can get there, and how I think the process is going to work to make it all happen.
Wow. Thank you, Russ, for sharing your thoughts with us. And for our viewers, if you're interested in learning more, the book is called Transition to Peace, A Defense Engineer's Search for an Alternative to War. And here's the cover. And if you look in the information box, there's contact information for Russ and a link to his website. Thank you for watching and have a peaceful day.
Thank you.